Can I play it for food? The Piano Legend. The evening rain had just stopped, leaving the downtown streets glistening under the warm glow of streetlights and neon signs. Steam rose from the wet pavement as the last remnants of the storm evaporated into the cool night air. The sounds of the city at dinner time created a familiar symphony: car horns, distant conversations, and the gentle hum of restaurants coming alive with their evening crowds. Frank Martinez sat on the concrete steps of the old Carnegie Library, his worn military jacket pulled tight against the October chill. At 58, his weathered face told the story of too many nights spent outdoors and too many battles fought both overseas and on the streets of his own country. His gray hair was longer than military regulation, and his beard was unkempt, but his eyes still held the sharp intelligence that had made him an exceptional soldier 20 years earlier. Beside Frank sat his most treasured possession, a battered guitar case that had seen better days. The leather was cracked and faded, and several of the metal latches had been replaced with improvised fixes over the years. But inside, wrapped in an old flannel shirt, was something that represented both his past and his last connection to the person he used to be. Frank had been living on the streets for 3 years now, ever since the combination of PTSD, chronic pain from combat injuries, and a series of unfortunate circumstances had cost him his apartment, his job, and eventually, his hope. He had served 2 tours in Afghanistan as a combat medic, saving lives and earning commendations. But the transition back to civilian life had proved more challenging than any battlefield he had ever faced. The irony wasn't lost on him that he now sat outside the same library where, as a child, he had spent countless hours practicing on the old upright piano in the community room. His mother, a single parent who worked 2 jobs, had recognized his musical talent early and had sacrificed to pay for lessons until he was good enough to earn scholarships. Before the military, before the war, before everything fell apart, Frank Martinez had been a different person, a person with a future in music. As the dinner hour approached, Frank could see well-dressed people walking past on their way to the upscale restaurants that lined this revitalized section of downtown. Most avoided eye contact, their gazes sliding past him as if he were invisible. He understood their discomfort. His appearance was that of a man society had forgotten, and his presence was an uncomfortable reminder of problems people preferred not to think about. Frank picked up a small cardboard sign he had made earlier that day. In careful handwriting, it read, "Homeless Veteran. Can I play piano for food?" It wasn't the first time he had tried this approach, and experience had taught him to expect more rejection than acceptance. Across the street, he could see the warm lights of Bella Vista, an expensive Italian restaurant where couples were enjoying romantic dinners and business associates were closing deals over wine and pasta. The restaurant had large windows that faced the street, and Frank could see a beautiful grand piano in the corner of the dining room, used occasionally by professional musicians for special events. Taking a deep breath and gathering what remained of his pride, Frank stood up, tucked his sign under his arm, and crossed the street. The maitre d' at Bella Vista looked up as Frank approached the entrance, his expression immediately shifting from welcoming to concerned. "Excuse me, sir," Frank said quietly, his voice still carrying the respectful tone he had learned in the military. "I was wondering if I might speak to the manager." The maitre d', a well-dressed man in his 30s named Robert, looked uncomfortable. "I'm sorry, but if you're looking for work, you'll need to come back during business hours and speak to—" "I'm not looking for employment," Frank interrupted gently. He held up his cardboard sign. "I was hoping to offer my services as a pianist, just for tonight, in exchange for a meal." Robert's expression shifted from discomfort to something approaching amusement. Behind him, Frank could hear a few of the restaurant's patrons beginning to take notice of the conversation. He caught fragments of whispered comments. "Homeless. Man. Probably drunk. Should call security." "Sir," Robert said, his voice taking on the practiced politeness that restaurants use to handle difficult situations. "This is a fine dining establishment. Our piano is reserved for professional musicians only." "I understand," Frank replied, his dignity intact despite the growing attention from nearby tables. "But I am a professional musician. I know it's hard to believe looking at me now, but I've been playing piano for 45 years. I have extensive classical training and I can play just about anything you might want to hear." A woman at a nearby table laughed, the sound carrying easily across the restaurant's dining room. "Oh, this should be interesting," she said to her companion loud enough for others to hear. "Maybe he can play chopsticks." Frank felt the familiar weight of shame and embarrassment, but he forced himself to remain calm. He had faced enemy fire. He could handle the cruel amusement of strangers. "Please," he said to Robert, his voice steady, but carrying an undertone of desperation. "Just one song. If you don't think it's appropriate for your establishment, I'll leave quietly." Robert hesitated, clearly torn between his professional obligations and some small spark of curiosity or compassion. The restaurant was full, the atmosphere was pleasant, and perhaps there was something in Frank's manner, the way he stood straight despite his circumstances, the intelligence in his eyes, the quiet dignity of his request, that gave Robert pause. "One song," Robert said finally, "but if our patrons are disturbed in any way, you'll need to leave immediately." Frank nodded gratefully and walked toward the piano, aware that conversations throughout the restaurant had quieted as people turned to watch this unusual entertainment. He could feel their skepticism, their amusement, their expectation that he would embarrass himself and confirm their assumptions about homeless people. Frank sat down at the beautiful Steinway grand piano and placed his hands on the keys for the first time in 3 years. The instrument was perfectly tuned, its keys responsive and smooth under his fingers. For a moment he simply sat there, feeling the connection between his hands and the music that had once defined his life. Then, without announcement or introduction, Frank began to play. The piece he chose was Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, a composition that required not just technical skill but deep emotional understanding. From the first notes, it was clear that this was not the performance anyone had expected. Frank's hands moved across the keys with the fluid grace of someone who had spent decades mastering his craft, and the music that filled the restaurant was hauntingly beautiful. The room fell completely silent except for the piano. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, forks were set down on plates, and every person in the restaurant found themselves drawn into the emotional landscape that Frank was creating through his music. The piece was both technically flawless and deeply moving, played with the kind of interpretive sensitivity that comes only from years of serious musical study and a profound understanding of human emotion. As the nocturne progressed, Frank's own memories came flooding back, practicing for hours in the library as a child, his first recital, the scholarship to music school that had seemed like his ticket to a different life, the dreams he had carried before the military, before the war, before everything changed. But more than memories, Frank felt the music itself returning to him, reminding him of who he had been and who, perhaps, he still was beneath the circumstances that had brought him to this moment. When the final notes faded into silence, the restaurant remained quiet for several heartbeats. Then, slowly, applause began to build, tentative at first, then growing stronger and more sustained. Frank looked up to see faces that had been skeptical or amused now filled with genuine appreciation and, in many cases, visible emotion. The woman who had made the chopsticks comment was wiping tears from her eyes. From the back of the restaurant, a familiar voice called out, "That was extraordinary." Marcus Wellington, who had been having a business dinner with clients, stood up from his table and walked toward the piano. He had recognized something in Frank's performance that went beyond technical skill, a depth of experience and emotion that spoke to the musician's true training and natural gift. "Frank," Marcus said, extending his hand. "My name is Marcus Wellington. I'm curious about your musical background." Frank stood up, surprised to be addressed by name and with such respect. "I trained at the Cincinnati Conservatory," he said quietly, "before the military, before everything else." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. He had noticed Frank around downtown for months, had seen him outside the library, and had always wondered about the story behind the man. "Would you be interested in playing here regularly? I know the owner of this restaurant, and I think we could arrange something that would be mutually beneficial." Frank felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Not just for a meal or a warm place to sleep, but for the possibility of reclaiming a part of himself that he thought was lost forever. 3 months later, Frank Martinez sat at the same Steinway piano, but everything else had changed. He wore a clean black suit, his hair was neatly trimmed, and his beard was well groomed. More importantly, he had an apartment, a steady income, and the respect of people.